You wake up dreading another day where everything seems to go wrong, where setbacks pile upon setbacks until you question your ability to handle life's pressures. The weight of your responsibilities crushes your spirit while you watch others maintain their composure through similar storms, leaving you wondering if you're simply not built for resilience. I am Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher emperor who transformed the darkest days of plague, war, and betrayal into opportunities for growth while ruling the most powerful empire in history. Through my daily practice of Stoic philosophy, I discovered that our worst moments contain the seeds of our greatest strength. The principles I'll share will give you an unshakable fortress of inner peace that no external circumstance can destroy. Using the same wisdom that sustained me through governing millions during Rome's most challenging period, what worked to maintain tranquility while bearing the weight of an empire will transform how you approach every difficult day. But first, like this video, subscribe for more Stoic wisdom, and comment below where you're watching from. I want to see how far the need for inner transformation has spread. When they placed the purple cloak upon my shoulders at age 38, I felt the weight of the entire Roman Empire pressing down upon me. This was not the life I had chosen. I was a philosopher, a student of wisdom, not a politician hungry for power. I had spent my youth studying the teachings of Epictetus, finding peace in contemplation and reflection. The throne was thrust upon me by adoption, not ambition. That first night as emperor, I lay awake beneath silk sheets that felt like chains, staring at frescoed ceilings that seemed to press lower with each breath. The purple cloak hung beside my bed like a shroud, its imperial dye extracted from thousands of murex shells, one representing a life in my empire, a responsibility I never sought. I wanted to tear it off, to run back to my books and my quiet meditations on virtue and wisdom. But lying there in that oppressive darkness, I encountered my first great lesson in transformation. My resistance to the situation was creating my suffering, not the situation itself. The purple cloak was simply cloth. The throne was merely a chair. The empire was just circumstances, vast, complex, demanding circumstances, but circumstances. Nonetheless, my anguish came from fighting what had already happened, from demanding that reality be different than it was. I rose from that bed a different man than the one who had entered it. I understood that the weight I felt was not the empire pressing down on me, was my own resistance pushing back against what I could not change. The purple cloak became my teacher that night, showing me that external burdens transform into internal strength the moment we stop fighting them and start learning from them. Every subsequent crisis would return me to this fundamental truth: what we resist persists, but what we accept transforms us. 3 years into my reign, death arrived at Rome's gates like an uninvited dinner guest who refuses to leave. The plague, as historians would later name it, swept through my empire with merciless efficiency. Each morning brought reports of thousands dead in Germania, in Gaul, in the very streets of Rome itself. I watched helplessly as the disease devoured legions, decimated cities, and turned my carefully ordered empire into a charnel house. I remember standing in my private study, holding a dispatch from the governor of Syria. The papyrus trembled in my hands as I read that entire cohorts had been wiped out, not by barbarian swords, but by invisible death that traveled faster than our swiftest horses. My advisors pressed me for decisions I felt unqualified to make. Close the borders, impossible commerce would collapse. Send physicians. We barely had enough for Rome. Flee to the countryside. What kind of emperor abandons his people in their darkest hour? That night, alone with my mortality, scrolls grim, tallies of the dead that arrived daily, experienced what I can only describe as a philosophical earthquake. Here was suffering on a scale that dwarfed my personal discomfort with power. Here was chaos that made my evening worries about Senate politics seem like children's games. Yet in that devastating moment, I discovered something profound. External catastrophe had clarified my internal purpose. The plague became my greatest teacher in transformation. While I could not control the disease, I could control my response to it. While I could not save every life, I could model courage for those who looked to me for strength. I began each day not by lamenting what I could not fix, but by identifying what I could do. Visit the sick, ensure grain distributions continued, maintain civic order through my own calm presence. In those death-soaked months, I learned that our worst circumstances strip away everything non-essential and reveal what truly matters. The plague taught me that trying to control the uncontrollable exhausts the soul, but accepting reality while maximizing our response within it creates unshakable peace. When external chaos reaches its peak, that is precisely when internal order becomes most crucial and most possible. The dispatch arrived on a spring morning that had begun with such promise. I was reviewing architectural plans for a new aqueduct when my secretary burst into my study, his face pale as marble. Avidius Cassius, my most trusted general, the man I had placed in command of the eastern armies, had declared himself emperor. My wife Faustina, the messenger reported, had allegedly spread rumors of my death to justify his rebellion. I felt the papyrus slip from my fingers as the full weight of betrayal crashed over me. This was not an enemy at the gates or a plague from unknown lands. This was treachery from within my own house. Cassius had served beside me for years. We had shared meals, discussed philosophy, planned campaigns together. I had trusted him with the eastern provinces, with the lives of tens of thousands of soldiers, and Faustin, my own wife, had she truly wished me dead. My first impulse was rage. I wanted to march east immediately, to crush this rebellion with the full might of Rome's remaining legions. I wanted to see Cassius in chains, to demand explanations, to hurt him as he had hurt me. For 3 days, I fed this anger, nurturing it like a flame I hoped would consume my pain. But anger, I discovered, burns the vessel that contains it more than anything it touches. On the 4th day, sitting in my morning meditation, I realized that Cassius's betrayal was revealing something crucial about my own attachments. I had expected loyalty because I believed I deserved it. I had assumed Faustina's devotion because I needed it. But expectations are just resentments waiting to happen. Other people's actions reflect their character, their fears, their desires, my worth or my failure. The betrayal became a mirror, showing me how much of my peace depended on others meeting my expectations. I learned that day that transformation comes not from changing what others do, but from releasing our attachment to what we think they should do. When I stopped demanding that Cassius be loyal or that Faustina be faithful, I found a peace that no betrayal could touch. Ironically, this inner freedom made me a more effective emperor. When I stopped taking disloyalty personally, I could respond to it strategically, with clarity rather than wounded pride. In the months following Cassius's rebellion, as I dealt with the aftermath of betrayal and the ongoing devastation of plague, I began developing what I came to think of as my inner citadel, a fortress of the mind that no external force could breach. This was not mere metaphor. It was a practical defense system that I built thought by thought, meditation by meditation. During the sleepless nights when the weight of empire pressed heaviest upon my soul, I kept a worn scroll beside my bed, and each night I would write my reflections by lamplight. These private meditations, never intended for other eyes, became my architectural plans for this interior fortress. I learned to distinguish between what happened to me and what I made it mean. Events themselves were neutral: plague, betrayal, military defeats, political criticism. These were simply facts. The suffering came from my interpretations, my judgments, my resistance to what I could not change. The foundation of my inner citadel was this recognition. My thoughts were the only thing truly under my control. Not the plague's path, not Cassius's choices, not the Senate's approval, not even my own body's eventual decay, but the mind that observed these things, the consciousness that chose how to interpret them. This remained sovereign. No external force could compel me to think specific thoughts or hold particular judgments. I practiced what I called the discipline of perception, learning to see clearly without the distortion of my preferences. When news arrived of another military setback, I trained myself to observe. The mind is telling itself a story about failure. When senators criticized my policies, I noted, the mind is creating meanings about approval and rejection. This wasn't denial or detachment, it was precision. By seeing my mental processes clearly, I could choose which thoughts deserved my attention, and which were merely automatic reactions. The walls of this citadel were built from daily practice. Each morning, before the first audience or the first dispatch, I would spend time in contemplation, reminding myself of what I could and could not control. Each evening, I would review the day's events through this lens, asking not, why did this happen, but how can I respond with virtue? This practice became as essential as eating or breathing, the daily maintenance of inner freedom. What I discovered in building this fortress was that true power comes not from controlling circumstances, but from managing our responses to them. The inner citadel gave me a space of calm reflection from which I could choose my actions based on wisdom rather than reaction. In the eye of any storm, political, personal, or philosophical, this interior space remained inviolable, offering the peace that the external world could never provide or destroy. My teacher Epictetus left me a simple iron ring when he died, valuable by imperial standards, but more precious to me than any crown jewel. Engraved on its surface were 3 words that became my daily practice: prefer what happens. This was not passive resignation, but the most radical transformation possible, learning to want what you have instead of having what you want. Before I understood this principle, I lived in constant tension with reality. I wanted the plague to end faster, Cassius to remain loyal, the Germanic tribes to stop their raids, the Senate to approve my policies without debate. Every day brought fresh evidence that the world refused to conform to my preferences. I was like a man standing in the rain, angry that he was getting wet instead of seeking shelter or accepting the water. The discipline of desire taught me that all suffering comes from wanting things to be different than they are, not the circumstances themselves, but my resistance to them. When I wanted the plague to end, I suffered. When I accepted that plagues run their natural course while I focused on my response, I found peace. When I wanted Cassius to be different than he was, I tormented myself. When I accepted his nature and focused on my own choices, I discovered freedom. This did not mean becoming passive or fatalistic. I still fought the plague with every medical resource available, still defended against Germanic invasions, still worked to improve imperial policies. But I learned to take these actions from a place of clear intention rather than desperate attachment to outcomes. I did what virtue demanded, then preferred whatever resulted. The practice began each morning with a simple question: what am I demanding be different today? Usually, the list was long: weather, people, political situations, my own physical discomforts. Then I would work through each item, asking, is this within my control to change? If yes, I planned appropriate action. If no, I practiced releasing my attachment to it being different. The most profound shift came when I learned to love fate itself, what we call amor fati, not just accepting what happened, but finding reasons to be grateful for it. The plague taught me compassion for suffering. Cassius's betrayal revealed my attachments and made me stronger. Military setbacks forced me to develop new strategies and discover inner resources I never knew I possessed. This discipline transformed every experience. Instead of fighting reality and exhausting myself in resistance, I learned to flow with circumstances while maintaining my inner compass. The iron ring reminded me daily that freedom comes not from controlling what happens to us, but from choosing how we interpret and respond to what happens to us. Each morning, before the palace stirred to life and the endless demands of empire began, I would sit on a simple stone bench in my private garden and prepare my mind for whatever the day might bring. This practice, developed during my darkest periods, became the foundation that sustained me through any crisis. The bench faced east, and I would watch the sun rise over Rome while conducting what I called my morning philosophical preparation. The first part of this ritual involved acknowledging the difficulties I would likely face. I did not pretend the day would be easy or that people would behave reasonably. Instead, I mentally rehearsed encountering criticism, betrayal, incompetence, and ingratitude. Today I will meet with interference, ingratitude, insolence, disloyalty, ill will, and selfishness. I would remind myself. This was not pessimism, but preparation by expecting these challenges. I could not be caught off guard or react from wounded surprise. The second element was remembering my own fallibility. I too was capable of error, pride, impatience, and poor judgment. By acknowledging my own imperfections first, I could meet others' flaws with understanding rather than righteous anger. We are all struggling humans, doing our best with limited wisdom and competing pressures. This perspective transformed potential conflicts into opportunities for patience and teaching. The third component focused on my purpose and principles. Why was I here? What did virtue demand of me today? How could I serve the common good while maintaining my integrity? I would remind myself of the four cardinal virtues: wisdom, justice, courage, and temperance, and commit to expressing them. Regardless of how others behaved, my peace would come not from others meeting my expectations, but from me meeting my own standards. The final part involved embracing uncertainty, while affirming my capacity to handle whatever arose. I could not know what challenges the day would bring, but I could trust my ability to respond with wisdom. This was not arrogance, but quiet confidence built through previous trials. The plague had not broken me. Betrayal had not destroyed me. Political setbacks had not defeated me. Each survived difficulty had strengthened my conviction that I possessed the inner resources to handle whatever came next. This morning practice created a psychological buffer between external events and internal reactions. When criticism came, I had already prepared to receive it calmly. When betrayal struck, I had already rehearsed responding with understanding rather than rage. When unexpected crises erupted, I had already affirmed my capacity to think clearly. Under pressure, the simple stone bench became my launching pad for each day, a place where I chose my mental stance before circumstances chose it for me. If morning reflection prepared me for the day ahead, my evening review ensured that each day became a teacher for tomorrow. After the last audience, when the palace finally grew quiet and the oil lamps cast dancing shadows on my study walls, I would conduct what became the most crucial practice of my philosophical development: honest examination of my thoughts, words, and actions from the previous hours. I kept a private journal, hidden from all advisors and secretaries, where I recorded my failures with the same precision that official chroniclers recorded imperial victories. This was not self-flagellation, but strategic learning. Every moment of impatience, every word spoken in anger, every decision made from ego rather than wisdom became material for tomorrow's improvement. I wrote as if addressing my future self, or a student who needed guidance about navigating similar challenges. The review followed a systematic pattern. First, I examined my emotional reactions throughout the day. When had I felt angry, and what triggered it? Usually, I discovered that anger arose when reality failed to match my expectations, senators opposing reasonable policies, generals requesting impossible resources, advisors offering incompetent counsel. Each instance revealed an attachment that needed releasing or an expectation that needed adjusting. Next, I analyzed my decisions and their motivations. Had I acted from virtue or from ego? Did I choose the path that served the common good or the path that protected my reputation? Had I spoken truth compassionately or used truth as a weapon? This level of honesty was initially brutal but ultimately liberating. By acknowledging my motivations clearly, I could consciously choose better ones tomorrow. The third element involved learning from mistakes without drowning in regret. The goal was improvement, not self-punishment. I would identify specific moments where I could have responded more wisely, then mentally rehearse better responses for similar future situations. If I had spoken harshly to a nervous advisor, I would practice patience. If I had made a decision from pride rather than prudence, I would examine what prudence might have chosen instead. The final component was gratitude for the day's lessons. Even failures served my development when properly understood. A moment of anger showed me where I still needed work. A poor decision revealed thinking patterns that required adjustment. Criticism from others offered perspectives I might have missed. Every challenging interaction became a gift that advanced my philosophical education. This evening practice transformed daily failures from sources of shame into stepping stones toward wisdom. I slept better knowing that today's mistakes were tomorrow's teachers, that no experience was wasted if properly examined and understood. Asterisk, in my private study, I kept a bronze death mask made from my own face, a startling reminder that the man wearing the purple cloak was temporary, but the office and its responsibilities were eternal. Each morning, I would look into those bronze eyes, and each evening, they would look back at me. This practice, which might seem morbid to some, became my most powerful tool for maintaining perspective and transforming daily pressures into opportunities for growth. The contemplation of death, properly understood, is not about being gloomy or fatalistic. It is about clarity. When you truly accept that your time is limited, that this conversation might be your last, that this decision might define your legacy, everything becomes sharper, more focused, more meaningful. Petty concerns evaporate. Essential priorities crystallize. The urgent gives way to the important. I developed this practice during the plague years, when death surrounded us like fog. Watching thousands die taught me that mortality is not a distant concept but a present reality. The plague took senators and slaves with equal efficiency, brilliant generals and common soldiers alike. Death, I realized, was the ultimate advisor, completely honest, absolutely impartial, utterly reliable in its eventual counsel. Each day, I would ask myself, if this were my last day as emperor, what would I regret not doing? Usually, the answer revealed actions I was postponing out of fear, conversations I was avoiding out of pride, or kindnesses I was withholding out of petty resentment. The death mask reminded me that there might not be a tomorrow to correct today's omissions. This perspective transformed my approach to conflict and criticism. When senators attacked my policies or generals questioned my strategies, I would think, in 50 years, we will all be dust. What matters is not who wins this argument, but how we conduct ourselves during it. This did not make me passive, still defended good policies vigorously, but it eliminated the personal sting of opposition and the ego-driven need to crush opponents rather than simply prevail in the argument. The most profound shift came in my relationships. Knowing that every interaction might be the last one stripped away pretense and pettiness. I found myself more quick to forgive, more generous with praise, more patient with weakness. If Faustina and I quarreled in the evening, I would not let anger carry into morning. What if one of us died in our sleep? Would I want those harsh words to be our final exchange? Death awareness also liberated me from the fear of failure. What was the worst that could happen? That I would die having tried and failed rather than having never tried at all. The bronze mask reminded me daily that courage becomes easier when you accept that loss of reputation, position, even life is inevitable anyway, in transforming my relationship with mortality. I discovered that death was not the opposite of life, but its essential partner, giving every moment its weight and every choice its significance. Asterisk on my desk. I kept a small gold medallion bearing the symbols of the 4 cardinal virtues: wisdom's owl, justice's scales, courage's sword, and temperance's bridle. This simple disc became my moral compass during the most turbulent periods of my reign, reminding me that regardless of external circumstances, victory or defeat, praise or criticism, health or illness, my essential worth remained tied to one thing alone: how virtuously I responded to whatever life presented. The revelation that virtue is the only true good came to me gradually, tested by each crisis I faced. When the plague ravaged my empire, I could not control the disease's path, but I could control my response, ensuring grain distributions continued, visiting the sick personally, maintaining civic order through calm leadership. My worth as an emperor was not measured by stopping the plague, which was impossible, but by how courageously and wisely I served during it. This principle transformed my entire understanding of success and failure. Previous to this insight, I had measured myself by outcomes: military victories, Senate approval, economic prosperity, territorial expansion. But these external results depended on countless factors beyond my control: weather, enemy decisions, economic cycles, the competence of subordinates. Tying my peace to outcomes meant living in constant anxiety about variables I could not influence. Virtue offered a different foundation. I could always choose wisdom over ignorance, justice over expedience, courage over cowardice, temperance over indulgence. These choices remained available to me whether I was winning or losing, whether circumstances were favorable or hostile, whether others supported or opposed me. My character was the one thing that remained entirely within my jurisdiction. The medallion's wisdom symbol reminded me to seek understanding before judgment, to acknowledge the limits of my knowledge, to remain curious rather than defensive when challenged. The scales of justice called me to fairness even toward those who wronged me, to consider the common good over personal advantage, to protect the weak even when it was politically costly. The sword of courage demanded that I face difficult truths, make unpopular but necessary decisions, and stand firm in my principles even under pressure. The bridle of temperance required moderation in all things: food, wine, anger, ambition, even virtue itself. What I discovered was that building identity on virtue rather than results created unshakable peace. External circumstances could strip away wealth, position, health, even life itself, but they could not touch the character I had built through countless small choices. Victory might make me famous, but virtue made me worthy. Others might judge me by my outcomes, but I slept peacefully knowing I had acted with integrity regardless of results. This shift liberated enormous energy previously wasted on anxiety about things beyond my control. Instead of worrying whether my policies would succeed, I focused on ensuring they were wise and just. Instead of fearing criticism, I concentrated on deserving praise through virtuous action. Instead of trying to control others' responses, I perfected my own character, trusting that virtue ultimately speaks for itself. Asterisk, my battle-worn commander's baton, scarred from campaigns against Germanic tribes and Sarmatian raiders, became a constant reminder that leadership means taking right action even when surrounded by chaos. This worn piece of wood, which had guided armies through impossible terrain and desperate battles, taught me that true power lies not in controlling circumstances, but in responding to them with unwavering virtue. During the Marcomannic Wars, I faced a situation that perfectly illustrated this principle. Our supply lines had been cut, winter was approaching, and enemy forces outnumbered us significantly. My generals were divided. Some urged immediate retreat, others demanded a desperate frontal assault. Political pressure from Rome demanded quick victory, while military reality suggested only costly stalemate. Every option seemed wrong, yet action was required. In such moments, I learned to apply what I called the discipline of action, focusing entirely on process rather than outcomes, on doing what virtue demanded regardless of results. I could not guarantee victory, but I could ensure that our response demonstrated wisdom, justice, courage, and temperance. I could not control whether my decisions would succeed, but I could control whether they honored the principles I claimed to serve. The key insight was understanding the difference between preference and attachment. I preferred victory, of course, but I was not attached to it. I preferred my soldiers' safety, but I was not paralyzed by fear of their loss. I preferred Rome's approval, but I was not enslaved to public opinion. This distinction liberated me. To choose based on virtue, rather than anxiety about outcomes, my approach became systematic. First, I would gather the best available information without demanding certainty. Certainty rarely exists in crisis. Second, I would identify what virtue required in this specific situation, regardless of consequences. Third, I would act decisively based on principle, not probability of success. Finally, I would accept whatever resulted without regret, knowing I had done my duty. This discipline transformed leadership from a burden into a calling. Instead of carrying the weight of potential failure, I carried only the responsibility of virtuous response. Instead of agonizing over whether my choices would work, I concentrated on ensuring they reflected wisdom and justice. Instead of trying to control subordinates' execution of orders, I focused on giving clear, virtuous direction and trusting their competence. The commander's baton reminded me daily that others watch how leaders respond under pressure. When I maintained calm during crisis, my composure became contagious. When I acted from principle rather than panic, my staff learned to trust their own moral compass. When I accepted setbacks without rage or despair, my army discovered resilience they never knew they possessed. Through this discipline, I learned that right action in wrong situations often creates the conditions for better outcomes than desperate attempts to force preferred results. I still keep the shattered pieces of a ceramic wine cup on my desk, remnants of a moment when anger nearly overcame reason and taught me one of my most valuable lessons about transforming destructive emotions into wisdom. The cup broke during a meeting with senators who were blocking crucial military funding while our soldiers faced Germanic tribes with inadequate supplies. Their petty political maneuvering while lives hung in the balance ignited a rage I had rarely experienced, as their spokesman droned on about fiscal responsibility while clearly motivated by personal grievances against my policies. I felt heat rising in my chest, my hands clenching involuntarily. When he suggested that perhaps fewer legions were needed anyway, I struck the table so forcefully that my wine cup shattered, sending ceramic shards and red wine across important documents. The room fell silent. The senators stared. I stared at the broken pieces, realizing I had just demonstrated the very lack of self-control that my enemies claimed, disqualified me from leadership. That shattered cup became my teacher. In the weeks that followed, I studied my anger like a physician examining symptoms. What exactly was this emotion telling me? Usually, I discovered, anger was information about my expectations. I became angry when reality failed to conform to my demands, when senators prioritized politics over soldiers' lives, when generals made obvious tactical errors, When advisors offered counsel that served their interests rather than Rome's, the anger itself was not the problem. It was a signal that something important to me was being threatened or violated. The destructive part was my unconscious belief that others should behave differently than they do. Senators had always been political. Generals had always made mistakes. Advisors had always had personal agendas. My anger came from demanding that they be different than their nature, experience, and incentives made them. I developed practical techniques for transforming this emotional energy. When I felt anger rising, I would pause and ask, what is this anger trying to teach me? Usually, it revealed areas where I was trying to control what lay beyond my influence. Then I would redirect that energy toward what I could control: my response, my decisions, my example. Instead of raging at incompetent advisors, I used that passionate energy to seek better counsel or make decisions myself. Instead of fuming at political opposition, I channeled that intensity into crafting more persuasive arguments or finding alternative paths to necessary goals. The emotional power remained the same, but its direction became constructive rather than destructive. The broken cup pieces remind me daily that anger can either destroy what matters to us or fuel our efforts to protect it. When channeled through reason rather than impulse, passionate concern becomes the energy source for sustained virtuous action. The senators who triggered my rage ultimately taught me that other people's limitations reveal nothing about my worth, but my response to those limitations reveals everything about my character. Anger transformed becomes the very force that builds the patience, wisdom, and strength needed to handle future provocations with grace. The torn campaign map that hangs in my study tells the story of our greatest military setback, a carefully planned offensive that collapsed when Germanic tribes formed an unexpected alliance, forcing us into chaotic retreat across frozen rivers. I keep this ruined document not as a reminder of failure, but as evidence of how apparent disasters become our greatest teachers when viewed through the proper philosophical lens. When the messenger arrived with news that our three-pronged attack had been routed, that 2 of my best generals were captured, and that we had lost nearly half our siege equipment, my first reaction was devastating disappointment. Months of planning, enormous resources, the lives of brave soldiers, seemingly wasted. The torn map showed red marks where our forces should have been, blue marks where enemy resistance was supposed to be weak, and reality had made mockery of our assumptions. Yet, as I studied that damaged map in the days that followed our retreat to winter quarters, I began to see something profound. Every setback contains information about reality that success often conceals. Victory can make us overconfident, causing us to miss critical factors that contributed to our triumph. Defeat strips away illusions and forces us to confront what we missed, ignored, or misunderstood. The failed campaign taught me that we had underestimated Germanic communication networks, overestimated our intelligence about tribal politics, and relied too heavily on tactics that worked against different enemies in different terrain. These were not moral failures, but knowledge gaps that only became visible through failure. Success might have reinforced our misconceptions. Setback revealed them clearly and demanded correction. I developed what I came to call the philosophy of obstacles as pathways. Every impediment to our action could advance our action if properly understood. When disease struck our armies, it forced us to develop better medical protocols. When supply lines were cut, we learned to operate with greater self-sufficiency. When political opposition blocked preferred policies, we discovered alternative approaches that often proved superior to our original plans. This perspective transformed my relationship with disappointment entirely. Instead of viewing setbacks as punishments for inadequate planning or proof of personal failure, I learned to see them as redirections toward better strategies. Instead of asking, "Why did this happen to us?" I began asking, what is this trying to teach us? The answer usually pointed toward assumptions that needed challenging or capabilities that needed developing. The torn map reminds me that apparent disasters often contain hidden gifts that only become visible with time and reflection. The failed campaign ultimately led to diplomatic solutions that proved more durable than military conquest would have been. Our forced retreat taught us winter survival techniques that served us well in later conflicts. The captured generals, when eventually ransomed, returned with intelligence about enemy organization that proved invaluable. Every setback, properly interpreted, becomes a stepping stone toward wisdom, resilience, and ultimate success. Deep in the palace gardens, hidden behind ancient olive trees, I built a simple wooden cabin where I could retreat from the endless demands of empire and reconnect with the philosophical foundations that sustained me. This humble structure, no larger than a modest bedroom, became my sanctuary for developing the inner resources that made external pressures bearable and even transformative. The cabin contained only essentials: a wooden chair, a small table, my philosophical texts, and writing materials. No imperial decorations, no symbols of power, no reminders of rank or responsibility. Here I could exist simply as a man seeking wisdom, rather than an emperor managing an empire. The contrast was deliberate and necessary. Only by regularly stepping away from external demands could I maintain the internal clarity needed to handle them effectively. In these periods of solitude, I practiced what I called philosophical self-development of inner resources that remained available regardless of external circumstances. Too often, we depend on others for our emotional equilibrium, approval for our self-worth, agreement for our confidence, comfort for our peace. But others are unreliable sources of these essential needs. People have their own concerns, limitations, and agendas that may conflict with our requirements for support. I learned to find within myself the encouragement, wisdom, and strength that I had previously sought from advisors, friends, and even enemies. When facing difficult decisions, instead of immediately consulting others, I would first spend time in solitary reflection, accessing my own moral compass and reasoning capacity. This did not mean ignoring good counsel, but it meant not being dependent on it for basic psychological stability. The cabin taught me that true strength comes from self-knowledge and self-trust developed through regular introspection. Each retreat session involved honest examination of my motivations, fears, hopes, and blind spots. I would write dialogues with myself, questioning my assumptions and challenging my convenient rationalizations. This internal conversation became more valuable than most external consultations because it was conducted without agenda or flattery. Solitude also revealed which of my concerns were genuine and which were merely products of social pressure or comparison with others. Away from court gossip and political positioning, I could distinguish between problems that actually required my attention and anxieties that existed only in relation to others' opinions. Many worries that seemed urgent in the palace disappeared entirely in the cabin's peaceful silence. Most importantly, these retreats built confidence in my ability to handle whatever challenges might arise. By regularly connecting with my philosophical foundations and inner resources, I knew that even if all external support disappeared, if advisors betrayed me, allies abandoned me, or circumstances stripped away every advantage possessed within myself, the wisdom and strength needed to respond with virtue. The simple wooden cabin proved that external simplicity often creates internal abundance. The succession scroll lay before me like a bridge between mortality and eternity, forcing me to confront the most profound question any leader faces: what will outlast my physical presence? As I prepared to transfer imperial power to my son Commodus, I realized that true legacy has nothing to do with monuments, territory, or even the continuation of one's bloodline. It lies in the wisdom shared, the principles modeled, and the positive changes sparked in other human hearts. Writing that succession document was simultaneously humbling and liberating. Humbling because it made clear that my time as emperor was temporary, a brief stewardship rather than permanent ownership. Liberating because it freed me from the exhausting effort to control what would happen after my death. I could not guarantee that Commodus would rule wisely, that my policies would survive political changes, or that history would judge my reign favorably. But I could ensure that I left behind something more valuable than political achievements, philosophical insights that could help others transform their own suffering into strength. My private meditations, never intended for publication, became my most important legacy. These honest reflections on applying Stoic principles to daily challenges contained the essence of what I had learned about converting worst days into opportunities for growth. Unlike military victories that could be reversed or buildings that could crumble, these ideas possessed the potential for immortality, not because they bore my name, but because they addressed eternal human struggles with timeless wisdom. I began to understand that impact matters more than recognition. The senator who learned patience from watching my response to criticism, the general who discovered courage through my example under pressure, the citizen who found peace by applying principles I had modeled, these people would carry forward the best of what I had learned, often without remembering where they learned it. This anonymous influence represented the highest form of legacy, wisdom so integrated into others' lives that it became their own. The succession scroll forced me to acknowledge that building others built something permanent. Every moment I spent mentoring younger leaders, every patient explanation of philosophical principles, every demonstration that virtue was practical, rather than merely idealistic, these investments in human development would compound long after my death. The people I had influenced would influence others, creating ripples of positive change that could continue for generations. This perspective transformed my final years from a desperate attempt to cement personal achievements into a generous effort to share whatever wisdom I had gained. Instead of hoarding insights or guarding philosophical discoveries, I became more open about my struggles and more explicit about the principles that had helped me overcome them. The scroll reminded me that death ends our time but not our influence. What we build in others' minds and hearts possesses the only immortality available to human beings, the continuation of wisdom that helps transform suffering into strength, obstacles into opportunities, and worst days into stepping stones toward our best selves. The emperor's throne sits empty now in my study. A carved marble seat that once symbolized ultimate power but taught me the ultimate lesson about powerlessness. This chair, from which I ruled the known world and commanded millions of lives, became my greatest teacher about the paradox that defines all human existence. Those who understand the limits of external control discover the boundless possibilities of internal control. Sitting on that throne each day, I wielded authority that most humans could not imagine. I could deploy legions, allocate vast treasures, determine life and death for countless individuals. Yet the more power I exercised, the more clearly I saw its fundamental limitations. I could not control the weather that determined harvest success, or military campaign outcomes. I could not control the thoughts in others' minds, or the choices they made when beyond my observation. I could not control disease, natural disasters, or the passage of time itself. Most ironically, I discovered that the external power invested in my position often undermined the internal power that actually mattered. When I tried to force senators to agree with my policies, I created resentment that made future cooperation more difficult. When I attempted to control my generals' tactical decisions from distant Rome, I undermined their effectiveness and my own strategic goals. When I demanded that my family behave according to my expectations, I damaged the relationships I was trying to protect. The empty throne reminds me that true power flows in the opposite direction of what most people assume. Real control comes not from managing external circumstances, but from managing internal responses to whatever circumstances arise. I could not prevent Cassius from rebelling, but I could control how I interpreted his betrayal and how I chose to respond. I could not stop the plague from devastating my empire, but I could control my own courage and wisdom in addressing its effects. This realization liberated enormous energy that I had been wasting on impossible tasks. Instead of exhausting myself trying to control senators' votes, I focused on presenting clear, compelling arguments and accepting whatever decisions resulted. Instead of micromanaging military campaigns, I selected competent commanders and trusted their expertise while supporting them with necessary resources. Instead of demanding my family's perfect behavior, I concentrated on modeling the virtue I hoped to inspire. The paradox deepened as I learned that releasing attachment to controlling others often increased my positive influence over them. When I stopped demanding agreement and started listening carefully to opposition, senators became more willing to consider my perspectives. When I ceased trying to force specific tactical decisions and began trusting my general's judgment, they sought my strategic guidance more frequently. When I quit insisting that my family meet my expectations and started accepting them as they were, our relationships became more honest and affectionate. The empty throne teaches that authentic leadership comes through example rather than force, influence rather than control, inspiration rather than intimidation. True power lies in mastering yourself so completely that others naturally want to follow your lead. My personal copy of Epictetus's teachings, its pages worn soft from constant handling and margins filled with practical notes gained through years of application, became the blueprint for transforming ancient wisdom into modern daily practice. Philosophy without application is merely intellectual exercise. True transformation comes only through consistent, deliberate integration of principles into the messy reality of ordinary moments. The key insight that revolutionized my approach was understanding that philosophical principles must become automatic responses, not conscious decisions made during crisis. When someone criticized my policies harshly, I needed to respond with equanimity instantly, not after several minutes of internal struggle to remember Stoic teachings about others' opinions. This required what I called philosophical conditioning, repeated practice during calm moments, so that virtue became instinctive during turbulent ones. I developed a systematic approach for embedding these principles into daily life. Each morning, I would select one specific Stoic concept to focus on throughout the day, perhaps the discipline of perception, or the practice of seeing obstacles as training, or the principle that others' actions reflect them rather than me. Then I would actively look for opportunities to apply this concept in real situations, treating each challenge as a chance to strengthen philosophical muscles. For immediate application during crisis, I created what I called the pause protocol. When faced with any situation that triggered strong emotional reaction, criticism, betrayal, setbacks, unexpected demands, I would stop and ask 3 questions. What is within my control here? How can virtue guide my response? And what would I want to model for others watching? This simple framework prevented reactive responses and created space for wise action. The transformation happened gradually but unmistakably. Initially, I had to consciously remember to apply philosophical principles, often after I had already reacted poorly. With practice, the pause between stimulus and response grew longer, giving me time to choose virtue over impulse. Eventually, virtue began emerging automatically, patience replacing immediate anger, understanding superseding judgment, acceptance flowing more naturally than resistance. My system for maintaining perspective under pressure became rich. During any crisis, I would remind myself of three fundamental truths. This situation is temporary. My response to it will reveal my character, and how I handle it will influence others who observe me. These reminders shifted my focus from how can I fix this to how can I respond to this with virtue. The worn pages of Epictetus reminded me daily that philosophy proves its worth through practical application. Abstract understanding of Stoic principles meant nothing until they changed how I actually behaved during real challenges. The margin notes, documenting my struggles and successes, became a record of transformation, not from human to superhuman, but from reactive to responsive, from victim of circumstances to architect of character. True philosophical living means building habits that automatically transform worst days into opportunities for demonstrating and developing virtue, creating internal resources that remain available regardless of external chaos. My final meditation entry, written as death approached during the Germanic campaigns, contains the essence of everything I learned about transforming suffering into strength. Accept what you cannot change, change what you can, and find wisdom in knowing the difference. In this lies all peace, all power, all possibility for growth. As I prepare to leave this world, I want you to understand that every word I have shared comes from direct experience with the darkest moments human life can offer. I have ruled during plague that killed millions, faced betrayal from those I trusted most, endured military defeats that cost thousands of lives, and struggled with the weight of impossible decisions. Yet these experiences, which could have broken my spirit, became instead the forge where my philosophy was tested, refined, and proven. The transformation I discovered is available to you right now. Wherever you are, whatever circumstances you face, your worst days, the ones that feel like punishment, that shake your confidence, that make you question your strength, these contain the exact lessons your soul needs for growth. The plague taught me compassion. Betrayal revealed my attachments. Military setbacks showed me resilience I never knew I possessed. Every apparent disaster carried within it the seeds of wisdom. This is not abstract theory, but practical reality. When your next crisis arrives, and it will arrive, for this is the nature of human existence, you can choose to see it as evidence of life's unfairness or as training for character development. You can rage against circumstances beyond your control or focus your energy on responses within your power. You can demand that others meet your expectations or find peace in accepting them as they are. The philosophy I have shared is not about becoming emotionless or passive. It is about becoming fully alive to what matters while remaining unshaken by what does not. It is about building internal resources so robust that external circumstances lose their power to destroy your peace. It is about transforming every setback into a step forward, every obstacle into strength training, every worst day into an opportunity for your best self to emerge. My greatest hope is that you will not merely understand these principles, but live them. Test them against your own struggles. Use them as tools for transformation. Discover for yourself that inner peace is always available, that virtue can flourish under any conditions, that your worst moments can become your greatest teachers if you approach them with the right perspective. The legacy I hope to leave is not monuments or military victories, but the knowledge that you possess within yourself, everything needed to transform suffering into wisdom, chaos into calm, and your worst days into stepping stones toward unshakable inner strength. This transformation is your birthright as a conscious being. Claim it, live it, pass it on to others who struggle in darkness, seeking the light of inner peace that no external circumstance can extinguish. Remember, you are stronger than you know, wiser than you believe, and more capable of transformation than you imagine.